friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and I'm coming to you from down in the cellar. I just got done putting some jam away on the shelves. It's our first preservation project of this year's season. I'm very excited to bring you that project that we did in this week's video. We're also going to walk around the garden. I'm going to do some work, kind of show you some of my tips and tricks for what's been working for me this year in the garden, and then do a little tour of the homestead and all of the things that we have growing. So if that interests you, why don't you stick around? But before we do get started, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is Backwoods Home Magazine and their sister magazine, Self-Reliance Magazine. You guys know I've been a big fan of this magazine for a while, and I've been partnered with them since last fall. I truly believe in this publication and the value that it brings to its readers. If you like my content, which is homesteading, family-centered, self-reliant, all of that kind of content, you are going to love both of these publications. And if you use the link in my video description, you can get 50% off an annual subscription to either magazine or both. So before I started homesteading, I was living in the suburbs, and I'm going to tell you a story about the first kind of homesteading projects that I did while I was living in the suburbs later on in this video. But I was dreaming of one day getting on my homestead and having some land to grow my own food. I was growing a little garden at the time, but my HOA had rules against what I could and couldn't do that were preventing me from fulfilling my homesteading dreams. And so during that time when we were kind of stuck there and figuring out where we were going to go next, I would read magazines like Backwoods Home Magazine. It was one of my favorites, and just file away in the back of my mind projects that I wanted to do as soon as we had the land to do it. So I've been a fan of this magazine for over 15 years now, and that's why I was so excited when they chose to partner with me. So make sure you check them out. But for now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that project that I mentioned that was one of the first things that got me in a homestead mindset. So let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, I did have a small garden at our old house in the suburbs, and I was able to grow a little bit of food for our small family at the time. But what I really found a lot of joy in during that season was foraging. So I bought some guides about foraging for wild plants, and I had a close friend who worked for the local township police department, and I asked him what the legalities were around foraging, what I could and couldn't bring home from what I found in public places like parks, and we had a cemetery behind our house. And he gave me what I was allowed to do, and mulberries were one of the first things that I foraged that gave me a lot of joy. I could harvest from foraging quarts and quarts of mulberries during the season and bring them home and turn them into jam and all sorts of things, and it really did help fill that desire to be preserving and harvesting food from the land. And so this is a really fun project that we look forward to every year because it does remind me of those first days when I was really wanting to homestead, and it just kind of brings me back to that season of life. So we like to lay down our sheet and shake the branches and let the berries fall and collect them up. We are very blessed to have probably 6 mulberry trees on our property. Some of the older ones are beginning to die, but the great thing about mulberries is they're kind of invasive. So the birds, we have so many birds on our property, and they eat the mulberries every year, and they drop the seeds throughout the property. And so along a lot of the fence lines, we get these new mulberry trees popping up, and many of the new ones that came up in the last 5 years are now producing lots of fruit for us. So I just want to encourage you, if you're in a place where you're really wanting to begin preserving food and your garden may not be very big, so it only really supplies you with enough for fresh eating, and maybe you can't find good local sources to purchase bulk produce, check into foraging. It's a great way to find fruits and even veggies. You can forage for a lot of wild greens and wild onions and ramps and all sorts of herbs and things that you can preserve and add to your pantry.
So my kids enjoy snacking on mulberries just raw. So they will be eating them while they're playing outside and they pick over most of the low-hanging fruit. So I have to really work to get a lot from the higher branches in order to have enough to preserve. And one of our favorite things to do with mulberries is to make jam. So this week I took a quart of strawberries and I added a quart of the mulberries that we harvested. To that we added a fourth a cup of lemon juice. Now the rest of your jam making process is going to be highly dependent on the type of pectin that you use. We're going to mash down our fruit, we're going to bring it to a boil, and then we're going to add our pectin, bring that to a boil again, and then we'll add our sugar. So what I recommend doing is if you're purchasing your pectin, to check the box that it came in, and it will give you all of the recipes that will make that jam product gel. If you try to alter the amounts of sugar for that particular pectin, your result might not end up as gelatinous as you want it to be. If you want a really low sugar jam, I recommend using Pomona's pectin. That's a great pectin that usually you only need to add about a cup of sugar to your whole batch, which is wonderful. And so once we get everything all brought to a boil as per the instructions for the pectin that we selected, then we can begin to fill our jars. I love making jam. It's one of the easiest things to do. I can whip up a batch of this in 15 minutes. I'm not kidding. Once you learn the process, it's just so easy. And these jars of jam bring us so much joy throughout the winter months. They taste like summer and all of that wonderful fruit. In the last 7 days, I was able to do a batch of cherry jam, and then I also made a batch of jelly from the pits of those cherries. I did this jam that I'm showing you in the video, and then I also did a batch of peach jam from some bulk peaches that I purchased at a farm store, just kind of on a whim. And we really can never have enough. With the size of our family, we can easily go through 2 to 3 of these jars of jam throughout the week, especially if I'm making a lot of homemade bread. And then whenever we do our canning, we do use our 4 jars canning lids. Make sure you check the link in the video description to get 10% off of your own canning lids. So this is a great intro to canning project. If you're new to canning, this is kind of something that I recommend that you start with. It's very easy to do. You're going to water bath your jars. It only takes 10 minutes in the water bath, and it really is pretty foolproof as long as you follow those instructions that I mentioned on your pectin packet. If you vary and try to omit some of the sugar, you're not going to get it to gel. And when I say gel, this is what I'm talking about. Your jam should be nice and gelatinous like this, so that it's easily spreadable on bread. This was just some of the leftover jam that we had that didn't fit into my canning batch, so I put it in the fridge and we enjoyed it for breakfast this week. So besides foraging for food, we're obviously trying to grow food on the homestead in the garden, and I thought I would take an opportunity, because I haven't done this yet this year, and kind of show you some of the things that we're growing. And I'm going to be working in the garden while I talk to you about some little tips and tricks that I'm using to grow and maximize our space. So the big picture here, it looks so beautiful and green and lush, but when we start looking closely, it's going to be pretty weedy. Please forgive the weeds. I'm a very busy mom and I'm doing the best that I can. The first thing I put right by my gate is a lemon verbena plant. This is one of those heavenly scents. It smells so amazing, and I love to pick a leaf and just kind of sniff it as I walk around the garden. And we will also do some projects with this lemon verbena later on this summer. But the first bed I come to in my garden are my cucumber plants. These cucumbers are just taking off. We have so many flowers, and it'll just be not too much longer before we are enjoying eating cucumbers. Now, I don't grow enough in order to make all of my pickles, because, to be honest, my kids don't like home canned pickles. They like refrigerator pickles that stay crisp, but they find that home canned pickles, they're just not a fan of the texture as much as they like store-bought pickles. So I just grow enough cucumbers to meet our fresh eating needs throughout the year and to do a few batches of refrigerator pickles. Now, on the edges of these beds, I had transplanted a bunch of volunteer dill, and only one of the plants survived. I was so bummed. Rabbits had come through and chewed down most of these that I had transplanted. So then I put some bush beans in place of where I had the dill. We have some marigold plants there to help deter some of the pests that like to eat the cucumber plants. And these are just looking lovely. I am very excited about how this bed looks. This year in the garden, I'm just really taking it one bed at a time. I had such a mess on my hands this spring from the neglect during my pregnancy last year. And so it's really taking me a lot of effort to pull all of the weeds that had went to seed last year when they were just sort of left. And so even the soil in the beds is pretty messy, but I'm just taking it one bed at a time and getting done what I can. So right next to my cucumbers, I have some hardneck garlic here, and you guys saw me harvesting the scapes on those plants in last week's video, and I'm finding there are just a few scapes here that I had missed. They really do blend in there, and they're easy to miss if you're not looking really closely. The ones in this bed got too woody to use. These are really hard, and that's what happens as those flower stalks grow. But I have two other beds of garlic over here, and the scapes that were in those beds must have been smaller last week, and so they're still tender enough to eat. So we're going to add those to our harvest basket and bring them indoors. Now we do grow hardneck variety. That is the type that grows scapes. There is also softneck garlic, and that's the type that you would typically braid to hang for storage. These beds will be occupied until probably for another month. That's when we'll harvest this garlic, and then we can cure it and get it in the pantry. And then once these 3 garlic beds are cleared, I will fertilize them, we'll work that through the soil, and then I will plant bush beans in place. Bush beans are typically my crop that I will put in any free bed space from here on out until probably late July, because we could never have enough green beans. In the 2 beds next to that garlic, we have onions. I have 3 total beds of onions, and we grew 3 different varieties. There was Patterson onions. Those are my main storage onions that I grow. And then I'm also trying 2 different varieties of red onions this year, and we're really excited about that. I think 3 beds is the perfect amount for my family. And you can see that they're starting to grow bulbs here, but just like the garlic, these will not be ready for harvest until probably later in July or likely the beginning of August. It just sort of depends on the weather for the year. And so in the meantime, if we need onion desperately, I'll pull some of the larger bulbs that I can see, but for the most part, we will harvest the green onion tops, and they give a lovely green onion flavor. The rule is just that you don't want to remove all of the green tops off of any given onion plant, or that could affect the bulb that's growing. So I'll just harvest maybe 1 or 2 of the green leaves of each plant and then leave the rest there so that it can continue to grow. And if you do that, you're not going to affect the size of your bulbs. Weeds are another thing that can definitely affect the size of your onion bulbs, and so I'm really trying to remain diligent removing the weeds in these beds. And it is a chore, like I said, because this soil was rather weedy after last year. And speaking of weeds, this is our corner potato patch. This is the one area that I have in ground in this garden. And these were potatoes that overwintered and came up this spring. So I wasn't able to till this area like I would normally do in the spring because the potato plants were already growing. So my plan for this area is once I harvest these very early potatoes, I will till this area up and amend the soil. And this is next year going to become a strawberry patch because unfortunately, all of my strawberry plants in my raised beds died over the last winter. It must have gotten too cold for them in the metal raised beds. They had survived the 2 years prior, but none of my strawberry plants came up in my raised beds this year, which was just tragic. I was so sad about that. So this is going to be our in-ground strawberry patch for next year. The next bed after my little in-ground patch is where we have our hot peppers this year. We don't grow a ton of hot peppers, just enough to fill this one little bed right here. We have a mix of cayennes, jalapenos, banana peppers, and we did do some Hungarian hot wax this year for Adam because he and the boys like that and a few things. We don't do much with these hot peppers. The reason I mainly grow these is for any spice that we need in some of my canned soup recipes, like my chili base and things. And then we will do some pickled hot peppers for pizza toppings throughout the rest of the year. And then any of the cayennes that we have extra will be dried down to make cayenne powder and things like that. But we really don't need a lot of hot peppers, so I don't really go overboard with that. We just have the one bed. Right behind that, I have 2 beds of okra. You may be wondering if you can grow okra in these very shallow raised beds. And yes, I've had great results in the past, so long as I'm making sure to fertilize the beds throughout the year, because okra is definitely a heavy feeder. So I have 2 beds of this. Adam loves okra. It's one of his favorite vegetables, so I make sure to plant a lot of that. And we do mostly Texas Longhorn variety okra. I prefer that to the typical Clemson spineless. The Clemson spineless, I find if I'm not going out to the garden multiple times a day to harvest it, it gets really long and woody before I get a chance to get to it. But if I grow the Texas Longhorn variety, it can get super long, even if you ignore it for a couple days, and it still stays nice and tender. So we have one bed here that is not currently mulched, and one that is, it seems like the one with the mulch on it is doing better. So I'm going to go ahead and find some straw and add that to the other bed. It helps with weed suppression and with moisture retention. This bed over here had my radishes in it during the early spring, and half of them I left to bolt because I really like the seed pods. If you don't know what bolting is, it's when the plant sends up its flower stalk. And then once it flowers and those flowers are pollinated, it creates these seed pods that taste like a very mild radish flavor. I love them. I've been snacking on them. There are very few left because I didn't leave a lot to go to seed this year. We have very few left because I've been snacking on them for the last week in the garden. But otherwise, I'm just pulling the rest of these plants, harvesting the pods that are left, so that I can free up the rest of this bed space. In the other half, I planted bush beans because, like I said, I put bush beans anywhere I have space this time of year. And so once I pull these radish plants, I will amend this soil and add some more bush beans to the place. So just enough for a little meal. I ended up chopping all of these up and adding them to chicken salad that I made later that night. I grabbed all of the greens from those radishes. We don't want those to go to waste. We're going to go ahead and feed those to the chickens, and they will turn all of those radish greens into delicious eggs for us. We had had a storm the night before with tons of rain, so everything is super wet. You can see that in the chicken run, but also look at my poor lettuce beds. You can see they're all knocked down from the high winds that we had. And they're knocked down because these lettuce plants were getting very tall. They were beginning to bolt, and they are done for the season. Lettuce gets very bitter once it begins to bolt. So we are also not going to waste this lettuce. We are going to feed it to the cows and let them turn it into beef for us. But you can see these are looking pretty rough. About 75% of the lettuce in this bed was done. I was able to harvest the rest of it and get it in the fridge. But that's the great thing about having animals, is that any of your garden plants like this that you work so hard to grow that you get sad about not being able to eat, it's not wasted because the animals will love it and they will turn it into a different form of food for you if you feed it to them. Lettuce was definitely my best crop so far this year. We have been eating lettuce at least once a day, a salad a day, for probably the last 3 weeks. And then prior to that, we were having them a couple of weeks when the lettuce was first coming on. I had a whole bed of that leaf lettuce that I just pulled. And then I have this whole bed over here of romaine lettuce. These are more of a head lettuce. And so I'm going to harvest the rest of this because it's going to bolt in the 90-degree days that we're going to have over the next couple of days. And I don't want to lose all of this beautiful romaine. It's so delicious. We've been enjoying it so much. And so how I harvest my romaine like this is I just cut it all off down at the base, and we can bring the whole head into the house versus like the leaf lettuce that I grew in the other bed. You would just cut off the outer leaves of it and let the plant continue to grow. You can see when you cut it at the base, that's what it looks like. But you can see some of the ones that I cut earlier last week are already beginning to regrow. And romaine is one of those crops, kind of like celery or green onions, where it will just continue to grow if you leave it like this. So I'm going to leave these and see what happens, if it's going to be bitter because of the heat, or if I can continue to grow some romaine after the heat spell that we're going to have over the next couple of days, and I'll let you know how that goes. The next bed I have here are my green peppers. So you guys know I love yellow monster peppers. I get my seeds from Baker Creek. They make these huge, delicious, prolific green peppers. And if you let them go longer, they turn into sweet yellow peppers, and they are my favorite. So my pepper plants here are looking really good. I showed you in a video last month how I topped these all off and just pinched off the top of the plants. And it looks so scary when you do that because your plant is left with barely anything. But you can see that they're already recovering from that, and they're even bigger and fuller than they would have been if I hadn't have pinched the top off. Now they have lots of side branches, and they'll produce me even more fruit. I'm thinking that a lot of these plants will probably need to be staked at some point because they're going to get so big. So we'll just put a stake down in the bed and give them support in that way. And here are my tomato plants in their beds with their support. I will link these trellises in the video description for you, but it's a jungle over here. We definitely need some airflow or these tomato plants are going to get fungus. So what I'll do is I'll go and I will remove all of the branches that are below the first set of flowers. Here are 2 zucchini plants, and they're in this little bed here, and I'm going to use tomato cages to grow these upwards this year instead of letting them grow out because I have them in this small bed. So what I'll do is as they grow up, I will remove the lower leaves, and they'll continue to grow up the trellis, and it will use that little tomato cage as support. I need to add them to the 2 zucchini plants that I have over here. I have terrible problems with squash bugs eating my zucchini plants, so I have to plant them in opposite ends of the garden to have the best results. Here we have a couple beds of potatoes that I put in the raised beds. I did this in a video several weeks ago, and you can see that the plants are already up above the straw, and very excited. We're going to have a really good potato harvest, Lord willing, this year. Here's just a volunteer brassica plant. I think it's broccoli coming up on the edge of this bed. The rest of the space is bush beans that need desperately weeded. Speaking of beans, I have 2 beds of pole beans. I much prefer growing pole beans to bush beans. They will grow up this trellis that we provided here. I find them much easier to harvest, and they will produce through the entire growing season instead of the bush beans tend to stop after several weeks of producing fruit. So I have 2 little areas with my pole beans here, and these are mostly yard-long beans. We love growing those, and they look so beautiful when they're all full and growing up in their tower. Here I'm going to show you my areas of shame now. This area is my garlic chives, and the rest of this bed had volunteer dill and cilantro that came up. And when the little itty-bitty volunteer plants were coming up with the weeds, I couldn't weed the bed without disturbing the tiny plants. And so it just kind of got away from me. I got busy dealing with other beds, and this is how it looks. But that cilantro is about to bolt, so I'm going to chop all of that down, and then we'll get the rest of this bed in order to plant some other crops. And here is my corner of shame. This is my asparagus bed. We harvested asparagus for several weeks and ate off of it, and then I let the rest go and fern out and then didn't touch it. And so this whole corner back here is just a mess. But I am a very busy mother. I have a small baby. I can only do so much. So we will get to that just as soon as we can, along with this terrible perennial bed. These are perennial herbs. I have some lavender here. There's some rosemary in there that are going to get choked out if I don't get busy with the weeds here. Here's a big comfrey plant in the middle that needs chopped down and used for fertilizer around some of my plants. And then over here on the side, I have more tomato plants with bush beans planted around the outside to fix some nitrogen into the soil next to the tomato plants. Same thing here on this little bed. So you can see the whole garden is kind of a mess when you really get in here and look. We've got lemon balm kind of making a carpet underneath my blackberries here. These are my thornless blackberries. They're looking lovely this year. We're going to have a really good harvest off of those, Lord willing. And I'm very excited. We love blackberries. We'll be making some jam, but mostly eating a lot of those fresh. And then we'll freeze extras for use in the winter in some of our baking. Other than that, around the edges, I just have pots of tomato plants. Basically, anywhere I can put them, I throw a tomato plant because you can kind of never have enough. So I showed you guys my corners of shame. I am not embarrassed to say that, I do what I can. I'm a mother of 9. I'm homeschooling on top of trying to grow a garden. And so I have areas that I think I'm very proud of. I've worked very hard out. And I have areas that need a lot of work. And it'll get there. We will get to it one bed at a time. Speaking of garden beds, I thought I would show you how the flower beds are looking at the front of the house. You guys saw me plant these earlier on Mother's Day, I think we planted these. So most of them are full of begonias and geraniums and maybe fuchsia plants and things. In some of these side smaller beds, I did plant tomato plants because I like to have at least one plant of slicers by the house for the kids to grab and snack on, and the rest of them are mostly cherry tomatoes, and the kids, when they're playing outside, will just grab them and snack. And then here on my green stalk, we've got a mix of flowers and basil. I've got a lot of basil in some of these little pockets, and that'll be great. I can go out and grab a quick handful of basil to add to some of our meals since this is right by the house. So I'm very pleased with these Vajayga beds. I think they're beautiful with the blue color on the side of the house. So make sure you check out the link in the video description. If you're looking for some pretty garden beds to add to your garden, you can get 10% off with the code there. You can see we've got our first little baby tomatoes. Otherwise, the flowers are doing wonderfully. I can't wait to see what these are going to look like in about a month when they're completely full and you can't see the soil and there's all of the color everywhere. These beds are bringing me so much joy. I just have to remember to come out here and pick weeds whenever I get a chance. And they do have to be watered pretty frequently. I've been doing it at least once a day because these sit on the south side of the house where they get a whole lot of sun on these really warm days. And so I don't want them to dry out, so we are watering. I might look into some irrigation for next year that would help make that a little easier for me. Other than that, the little orchard is doing well. We've got apples and gooseberries and peaches growing, along with the wild fruit like the mulberries and the crab apples. And I'm just so excited about this growing season. I really didn't do much last year because I was so sick with little Abigail's pregnancy. But this year, my energy is back. Abigail's starting to give me nice naps that allow me to get work accomplished. And so I just have this renewed motivation to get out here and get the property cleaned up and grow some delicious food for my family. So we'll be back next week with another video for you, friends. I hope you enjoyed this peek into what's going on in the homestead. We'll see you later.